To you, the saints, this sermon recap is for 18C, the year of Luke, the 18th, proper 18, preached at University Lutheran in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, September 8th, the year 2013. Sunday, the proper 18 Sunday was a special Sunday for us here at University Lutheran for a number of different reasons. The ELCA was celebrating their 25th anniversary, and so these shirts, many of our members purchased these shirts, God's Work, Our Hands, University Lutheran on the back. It was also our welcome back Sunday potluck for college students, and so we actually had a worship service outside. And the text, because of the celebration of the ELCA, the texts were not the typical proper 18. We got a gospel from John, John 15, where Jesus says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. You did not choose me, I chose you. Love one another as I have loved you, so love one another. If you follow my commandments, I call you friend. That little piece out of John. But this second lesson from 2 Corinthians, from now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. So if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting the message of reconciliation to us. So we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We entreat you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, that we may become the very righteousness of God. The X marks the spot. I opened the sermon talking about a time when my daughters, just two of them then, were searching for a treasure, and they dug by a treasure map for about a week or week plus, looking for a rock that was marked by an X. And since we were outside and the congregation was facing the campus, I took a piece of sidewalk chalk and drew a giant X onto the sidewalk, saying that even though we were now using John in this beautiful text from 2 Corinthians, one basic premise that comes from Luke, that since Luke tells the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, but then also writes the book of Acts about the church, the birth of the church, the work of the church, this basic premise, that Luke always sees us by way of the Christ, that Luke always sees the church, always sees the world through the Christ, and at the same time, Luke always sees the Christ by way of the church, through the church. So first things first. In John, Jesus is the Word that is before all things. Not one thing comes into being that does not come into being through this Word, and so Christ chooses us. I see you. I see my members. I see the saints. I see the university. And that's what I had as the people sat on lawn chairs facing the university with this X in front of them to see the university through the Christ. This is first. This is most important. That we actually included that last verse. We didn't have that in yesterday's second lesson, but God has made us righteous by seeing us through Christ. That Christ took our sin, became sin, that we might become the very righteousness of God. That when God looks at us, he sees us through the Christ. As Luke looks at the church, he sees the church, he sees the world, he sees the cosmos, he sees creation by way of through the Christ. That's the first thing. But for the sermon, this just as important. That Luke sees the Christ through us. First, since Christ is the vine, we are the branches, and Jesus bids us to make good fruit. That we no longer see one another, see the world through by human means, from a human point of view, but with this Christ between us, we see one another. But as the university looks back this way, at the congregation sitting on the lawn, they are the ones who are put on the X. That this one sentence, God is making God's appeal through us. The reconciliation belongs to God, And yet God entrusts us with the message of reconciliation. God has finished that work in Jesus, and then in Luke, Acts, in 2 Corinthians, hands it to us. Hands the proclamation, the good news of that reconciliation finished by God in Christ. God has been reconciling the world in Christ, and He hands us, He makes us ambassadors. He's making God's making His appeal through us. Just that one sentence, just the honor and the privilege and the weight of that one sentence, all the work that Christ has been doing, all the work that Christ has done, all the work that God has done since the very beginning of creation, He entrusts to us to say to one another, be reconciled to God. That as the campus looked back at those saints sitting on the lawn, that they are the ones, the members, the students who are there, who are on the X, and that the world will see Jesus through us. Thus, God's work, our hands, everything made new in the ELCA, that there is not one thing in your life, there is not one thing in your story that is in Christ somehow ignored or passed over or minimized. The joys, the sorrows, the successes, the failures, all of those things in Christ are somehow redeemed in such a way that then you bear the message of reconciliation to the world, to the neighbor, to the classmate, to the family member. That the world sees the Christ through us. We are the ones God has entrusted with the very message of reconciliation. So X marks the spot that Luke, for 2 Corinthians, for Acts, that we see one another no longer from a human point of view, but we see one another through the Christ. But just as important is that the world, the rest of creation, sees the Christ through the church, through us together. To you, grace and peace, and be well in all things, bear good fruit.